Welcome to Socializing Security, where every week we have a discussion about security, compliance, and beyond.
Our goal is to learn and grow by socializing each week's topic with each other, our guests, and with you.
A quick compliance note, this podcast is meant for informational purposes only and should not be considered legal or regulatory advice.
We're glad you've joined us, and we hope you'll learn along with us. Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of Socializing Security. We are excited to talk to you again this week. Milu, how are you doing?
Doing well. I'm recording out of a different studio today, so happy to be elsewhere at the moment, but happy to be here and talking about social media and how it ties into security and compliance. And especially with your background, I think you're going to have a lot to offer here.
Yeah, I've been known to do social media quite a bit in the past and have some strong thoughts that go along with it. So we thought this would be an easy topic for us to talk about and hopefully for Milu to kind of drive a lot of good compliance and security questions out of me as to how I've thought about it in the past, because, you know, we've talked in previous episodes about social media and you know, privacy concerns and sharing stuff online and whatnot. So we'll be thoughtful about what we've already discussed a little bit, but there's some color in between some of those topics that we felt we could contribute a bit more to the discussion. And again, this is all with the intention of trying to generate discussion with you, or for you to then talk to others about. That really is our goal here. So yeah, a lot of interesting things that we can get into with this beyond what we've already talked about. But think about the things that we've talked about in previous episodes around your digital footprint and how much information you're leaving out there. If you're a content creator, which if you're on social media, you are a content creator, you're creating things, you're putting things out there that, you know, what you're creating, how you're creating it, how you control it changes when you share it publicly. And then, you know, privacy concerns just in general, you know, making sure that you're not sharing too much out there. I think we'll talk about that in a bit more depth as well.
Yeah, I think from a compliance officer perspective, it's always interesting too, because when we're having a lot of risk management discussions, we're always talking about reputational risk, right? Worst case, whether or not you have a data breach or there's something related to your organization that gets out in a way that maybe isn't supposed to. I think there's a lot around training team members, right, of what's confidential versus what is public. I legitimately this week had to have a 15-minute overview training with a marketing professional just about hey, within your role, right, what is the approval process to confirming that a press release only contains public information and not non-public information, that it shouldn't be blasted out in an email blast, which that one felt a little bit counterintuitive. This individual has been doing this role for a long time. They pretty clearly understand their job would be on the line, right, if they're suddenly posting trade secrets on the internet or on social media. But there is definitely a continued importance as to making sure that organizations are mindful about what they're sharing, because again, it lasts forever, right? In the same way that we've had conversations about being mindful of your digital footprint, of things that you put out there you can't really claw back. And it's the same thing with organizations and being mindful of that. So I think thinking through what are the ramifications of content is really important. And then also I just think having continued risk-based discussions with your team members about what are you posting online, you know, and how does it actually represent the company continues to be important.
Yeah, and I think for all of us as individuals, one of the most important things to start with is, you know, why are you getting on the social media? I honestly view it, and maybe this is my background as a theater nerd, is, you know, what is my persona? What am I doing up there? What am I trying to get across? Who am I trying to be? Because you're not always going to be the same person online as you are in person. Just like you're not the same person at home as you are at work. I'm different with my kids than I am with my wife. We all have different personas in different areas of life. And I'm not suggesting it, but it is a decision that you be unauthentic online, that you have a burner account that you could just go around and troll people. I don't really approve of that kind of thing, but be out there, be authentic, but you don't necessarily have to share everything. When I talk to my friends, I tell them stories about my family and things that are going on in my personal life. But if you happen to look at my my Twitter account before I kind of cleaned everything out of there, I didn't post pictures of my kids. I didn't really talk about my kids that much because, to that point of your digital footprint and privacy concerns, I didn't necessarily want them to be that public. Like, this is my decision to be public out there. And that also applies to your business persona. So who I am at work is different than my personal account potentially. And there are lots of people, and I don't have a strong opinion of it one way or the other, that they have their work account and then they have their personal account, and they do different things on each one, and they're mindful about that. I, on the other hand, was always very much of the mindset of, I am a singular person who happens to have associations with a lot of different things. I have associations with my family, with my friends, with my job, with other extracurricular stuff that I do. Therefore, my account is going to be me in all of those different facets. And some of those facets will change over time. And sometimes I do work stuff, and sometimes I talk about curling, and sometimes I talk about other personal things on there. And that's part of being a whole person, in my opinion. So I come at it from that perspective, but I'm not saying that's right or wrong, or there's a better way to do it, or that's the best way to do it. My suggestion to people is always that be mindful of that, be thoughtful of that. Doesn't mean it can't change. It just means that when you sit down to go type in something into that, if you have that frame built around it, you're less likely to breach it. You're less likely to go to a place that you don't want to be online. And to your point, not share something that you shouldn't, or to post something about a competitor that maybe you shouldn't, because, yeah, sure, this is my personal account and I work for that particular company, but I don't necessarily, quote unquote, shill for them while I'm on this account. But at the same time, I'm still associated with them. And if I go out and start bashing a competitor, then that doesn't always have a good look to it.
Yeah, I always think that's so interesting and I mean, we do this as well, like on our podcast here, right? Where we're like, hey, we do have affiliations with organizations as a part of our job, but we're representing ourselves and our viewpoints. Like, we're not speaking on behalf of the companies that we work for. And I do think it's important to have those types of disclaimers. But when you're thinking about a brand where you're potentially having personal and like business types of posts start to blend together, it starts to make that delineation like harder to being like, oh, well, this person works for this job and does this thing in their personal life. We've definitely seen news stories, right, where individuals have posted something on a personal account and then have lost their jobs, right? Like, they are inherently related. And again, I think that ties into the digital footprint of being mindful of like, how can this stuff be held against you potentially? Or can this, what is the context that's needed to interpret the content that you're posting to make sure that you do have a brand that lines up with your values and views?
Yeah, and it's important to understand what restrictions you may have on any of those other facets. Work is the most obvious one. Most companies these days have a social media policy. These are the things you can and can't say about us or your job on social media without permission. Yeah. Be aware of those. Those are important. They're generally there for a reason. Obviously, they want to be associated with your good brand. They don't want you to have a bad brand. So that's helpful from that perspective. They would also want to take advantage of your brand. Like, if you've got lots of followers and your followers are potential customers or influencers that you could exert influence on, they want that. So they generally are there to make you a better person online, and also to make sure that nothing bad happens that's going to fall back on them. And again, even if it's a purely personal account where you only interact with friends and neighbors, still be aware of those things, because it's not hard to connect you to different parts of your life. Like, you can have 3 completely separate social media accounts, and it's not that hard to reconnect them if somebody really wants to find out, clearly this person's account is only for work. So I wonder if they have a personal account somewhere. It may not be on the same platform. They may be able to go find it. And, situations like Cambridge Analytica gave us a really good view as to how easy it is to reconnect what we think of as anonymous data.
Yeah. When we're thinking about, I guess the next part of it is like, we're pretty clear on like understanding like your brand and who your audience is, and then thinking through like, what are the ramifications of posting on one account or the another. I guess, does that tie into then also like, what about the platforms that you're using for your brand or your posts?
Yeah, very much so. The approach I've always taken with that is that, for each platform, you can pick a different persona. You could pick a different audience. You can pick a different purpose for it. So back in the few years when I was actually using Facebook, I viewed Facebook as my super personal. Like, that's where I'm going to connect with family and friends, and we're going to have personal conversations in that space. That's the space where I would share things about my kids. Still pretty restricted as to what I would share. Like, hey, so and so did such a great job at this sports game or this musical or whatever it was they were involved in, and that was about it. Like, I wasn't necessarily, I purposely tried to avoid talking about birthdays and things that did provide that personal identifiable information that could, you collect it from enough different places, you've all of a sudden got enough to do harm. I'm paranoid that way. But when I was on Twitter, back in the day when I was on Twitter, it was very, very business focused. It was more about my friends in the IT community. That's where we built things like the community and around VMware, was on Twitter, and we were all on Twitter and we were all communicating together. Sometimes it was private, most of the time it was public, and we would share information there. And I was a representative for my company at certain points in my career where, like, I was the face of the company and I used that same account. Now I don't use either of those. I've broken both of those. One completely, I'm completely off Facebook. Twitter, I still have an account because I did have such a presence there. I want to maintain and protect it. I look at it occasionally, but honestly, I don't even look at it very much these days. And that's another whole aspect of things as to which platforms to choose. But you have to understand who's going to be there. Who are you going to be talking to? Otherwise, you're talking to yourself, and that's not social. that's not. You're just yelling into the void. Which, if that's what you want social media for, then go for it. Like, I know people that do that, and it's therapeutic to them, and they have to type it somewhere, and they're going to create an anonymous account that can't be tied to them, and they're just going to complain about whatever they want to complain about, and they don't care if anybody sees it. That's cool too. That's a valid use case for it. TikTok, Instagram, Threads, there's so many different choices now that all have slightly different types of communities and slightly different reasons for using them, that may or may not appeal to you. There's certain platforms I've never touched because they just don't hold interest for me. Others I've tried to find, and I find interesting content, but I don't create content on them. So it's really about deciding what you're going to do there. LinkedIn's another one that, kind of feels like as a professional, you kind of have to have, especially if you're in the IT space. It's kind of these days it's kind of the main connective tissue for the IT network that I've been a part of. And so you have to be there so people can find you and can contact you, because they can't necessarily do that on Twitter these days anymore, like we used to be able to.
Yeah, LinkedIn is such an interesting one, right? Because it's really meant for business related activities. Like, you don't really see very often people posting like personal posts on LinkedIn. I think sometimes maybe you see people posting a little bit more on the personal side to try to make it feel less corporate.
Yeah.
But I think what's actually interesting about it is, like, from a privacy perspective, we've all actually like collectively agreed to being like, sure, our resume can be posted publicly, and that's going to help us get a job. And so basically we've all decided to being like, hey, like, our job history, that data is worth less to us to keep it private as opposed to us getting our next job, and being attractive to recruiters or companies that are looking for particular like roles to fill. I think that's what most of us use LinkedIn for, is networking and engaging with other professionals. I think it's changed very rapidly. I think LinkedIn, yes, especially with Twitter, like with all the changes in Twitter, I think a lot of users decided to be like, okay, let's buy into LinkedIn more, yep, and have larger communities there. I think LinkedIn is a platform. I mean, honestly, from a security perspective, any of these platforms, you definitely need to make sure you have two-factor authentication turned on as like a minimum, because there's nothing worse than being the person that's like, oh, my account was hacked. I think there's honestly like you can make the argument that LinkedIn as a place to be hacked could potentially be more damaging because it could impact your, your job, your livelihood,
Mm-hmm.
as opposed to, if you have a private account on Instagram or something like that, that might be less damaging if somebody gets access to it, as opposed to somebody being able to post on your behalf, like that tags your employers or all of your colleagues.
Yeah, and that's something to think about is, well, I guess on any platform really, your private communications, those direct messages, those types of things are, you have to assume they're not private. You have to assume they're not only going to be seen by the person you send that message to, because some other corporate entity owns that platform, which means that they do have access to it at some level. Whether they choose to take advantage of it or not is picking up a thread that I kind of left earlier, part of the consideration there. So, do you consider the social media company itself and how it behaves, what it goes to Congress for, or to some government entity asking for? How well do they work with government entities when they're looking for data? Like, do they fight back against subpoenas for data, or do they, silently do it, not relying on the courts to force them to do it? Those types of things are worth considering, especially depending on, again, what your persona is, what you're going to use it for, and deciding if you're going to put that kind of information out there. Sure, if you've got a personal Instagram and you're just taking pictures of, my favorite flower of the day, probably not very dangerous. If Meta were to decide to go and share that information with the government, or got hacked by China, or whatever it might be. But you also have to think about, like, okay, so did it include all the tagging, the geotagging that modern phones are putting on every picture? Because if it is, well, now somebody can track everywhere that you went every day because you took a picture of a flower every single day. And it's pretty easy at that point to tell where you live, where your friends and family live, where you like to go on vacation. Like, those types of things now become pretty obvious. So you got to think about those things. Depending on how politically minded you are, you may consider, hey, my money is going to go help benefit some billionaire somewhere. Do I want them to benefit off of me being on their platform? Ads are going to be served to me. I mentioned Cambridge Analytics. That was a big kerfuffle a few years back with Facebook. There's a lot of information about you that can get generated without you even giving it up in the first place. And then of course there's this whole thing with TikTok going on right now, and how closely aligned is it with the Chinese government, and how dangerous is that? Are they using it to manipulate us? Are they harvesting data out of that? You've got to balance all that. And some of those platforms make it easier than others to control how manipulated you can be. We talk a lot about the algorithms and what they're doing to our brains, and particularly to kids. Some of them are more controllable than others. Some of them you don't have a lot of control over what you see, and you're just going to see whatever they shove at you. Some of them are going to be much more controlled. Like Twitter went through this when I was an active user, and I purposely started creating lists and other ways to look at it. So it wasn't just the feed they were trying to give me. I want to start with what is the most recent tweet, and I want to go back as far as I can to try and catch up with my friends. If I can't get all the way, fine, I missed some stuff. But here's a list over here of those accounts. I want to see everything they post. So I go and look at that list first, and I see everything that everybody posted in that list. And then I go to my chronological list. I didn't like having the algorithm decide what I was going to see. Heard a funny comment on the radio this morning about, if you don't trust robots for this, why would you trust them to create a playlist for you? Pushing for human curated content, which I found delightful, because I'm one of those people. I would prefer to know that somebody like me created this list and served me something that will be of most interest to me.
Yeah, I do think, as we're being mindful too about like privacy concerns and how you're using these tools, of actually like take the time to look at the settings that are available to you, especially when it comes to like targeted advertisements, and like assess what controls you have turned on your accounts to just see what are you being influenced by, because you can actually opt out of a lot of these things. And it's actually a pretty neat exercise, specifically on like Meta as an example, that you can go in and actually really customize what you want to see on ads specifically and opt in to, automated processing, yes or no. So I would definitely recommend people to take some time to look at it, because it can also be like pretty interesting. It also can maybe answer some of those questions of how's my phone listening to the conversations that we're having when suddenly you get an ad for toothpaste after saying you've been, ran out of toothpaste. I would definitely encourage people to look into it, because it has a lot more to do with your social media search, as well as the people that are pinging off of your phone and your Wi-Fi, than it does necessarily that your device is listening to you. But I would definitely encourage people to look into the options. And then I did want to just circle back too on thinking through encryption and the protection of the information that you're sharing within these tools. There is definitely a push on the social media platform side to potentially basically try to like encrypt all messages by default. That's where a lot of the actions that are going through Congress right now have a lot to do around CSAM and making sure that law enforcement can still get access to potentially malicious messages, which becomes more difficult if the social media giant can also not access them. So that's where a lot of the encryption comes to mind. It is just then encouraging everyone to be mindful of which platforms you're using to share what kind of information, in the idea of think about like basically assume that anyone at any of these companies could theoretically access your messages. And if that's okay, then continue to use them as you were. But if it's not, then consider an alternative option.
Yeah, the encryption piece is a really interesting one. I'm actually listening to an audiobook right now that does a good job of kind of documenting the modern cybersecurity space and kind of where we've been and how we've gotten to where we are. And one of the big things that has been focused on is encryption and some of this backstory of how nation states and organizations have used encryption for good, have used encryption with backdoors for maybe not so good. So it's definitely a topic that's top of mind for me right now as we're recording this, because to me, encryption is a very important thing. One of the main social tools I use these days is Signal, and it is about very private communication, and it is end-to-end encrypted. And that's one thing to be aware of is, I want my stuff encrypted so other people can't read it. Well, where is it getting encrypted and where is it getting decrypted is the most important part of that equation. Because if it's getting, one of the things they talked about in that book is that if it gets intercepted before it's encrypted, that's a problem. So this was a problem with Google back in the earlier days, where they didn't encrypt stuff that went between their data centers. And so somebody figured out that, hey, if I'm listening between their data centers, I'll catch it. I will never catch it between Google and their customers because they're encrypting that traffic, but they don't encrypt it as they move it to another data center for data protection, for example. This is one of those places where if you're going to protect your data, make sure it's protected en route to the secondary, tertiary locations. And they were able to intercept it. And Google's like, oh, well, this was our plan to do, but I guess we better do it right now. And so they had to take the hit on performance and compute power to encrypt it before they left the data center. Tools like Signal are designed to encrypt on my device. And when I send you a message, it decrypts on your device. The company that creates Signal doesn't have any idea what that message is at all. They have no way of getting into that, as far as I know. That's, and again, knowing who the people who created it is a big part of it for me, because I've looked into the background of these people, and they've been at the forefront of encryption and security for years, and want to, everything I've read, everything I've seen, every interview, they genuinely want to create a situation where people can truly talk privately and not have to worry about anybody listening in. And, you put it in the context of 9/11 and ISIS and other terrorist type organizations. And the government wants to do everything they can to try and figure out who the bad people are so that they can stop them and ideally get the signals that they need to say, hey, there's a bad event about to happen. Let's get in its way, make sure it doesn't happen. And we've seen situations where that's worked. We've seen situations where it hasn't worked. What's the right balance between, me and you being able to talk privately, but two terrorists not being able to talk privately? That's in the last 20 some years has proven that there's no easy solution to it. And, that's an area where I'm not an anti-government person by any stretch of the imagination, but I don't know that I would lean towards giving them unfettered access. And that has been a history with the U.S. government and other governments, is that they work with the tech companies to create backdoors so that they can get access to things that we aren't even aware of. And there's historically been a big market for zero-day vulnerabilities that the governments have played pretty heavily in over the years as well. So it's kind of scary stuff. Not here to play fearmonger. As usual, I do tend to go down that rabbit hole a little bit too far. But again, making sure that you understand the tools you're using, how they work. You don't have to be super geeky about it, but talk to the people who in your lives who do understand these things, or the people that have used these tools and are asking you to join them, so that part of a tool being successful for me is having my friends and my family on it. This is a classic one with WhatsApp. I'm not a big fan of WhatsApp. I just don't like the interface. It doesn't work for me. But every so often in that situation where, well, everyone else is using it, so you kind of have to, you don't have a choice. I'm like, can't we all switch to Signal? Wouldn't that be great? And they're like, no. There's sometimes you've got that person that just cannot comprehend another application. And so occasionally I have to download it again and sign back in and use it, because there's a gravity of data in that regard.
Yeah, I think being mindful of what platform you're using for what type of communication is really continues to be important. And then also, I hate to say it, but review the settings. Like, take some time to actually make sure, one, from a security perspective, you have everything turned on you're supposed to. Make sure you do have two-factor authentication turn on. If you've ever been locked out of a social media account, like, it is a pain to get back in. It's nearly impossible to get back in. So I would definitely recommend that you have like recovery set up and everything so that you can log back in, to just avoid the hassle of having to, man, I think they generally now do like photo evidence, and you have to like print out a photo of yourself and sign. Anyways, there's like a whole process to get back in. I will say that companies have gotten pretty creative around how they're actually going to verify you if you're locked out, but it takes a long time. I would definitely encourage turn on two-factor. And then also look at the privacy settings, look at what you can opt in and out of, and then think around too of like, what are you sharing on which platform? Again, if there's potentially like really private messages that you want to be sharing, maybe you should consider using like a fully encrypted end-to-end device or messaging app such as Signal as an example. But if you're thinking about how you want to portray yourself, think about what the audience is on these platforms, who you're sharing with. Is your profile public? Is it not public? If it is public, are you sharing information that maybe you shouldn't? We've talked about this before on the podcast, that like when Brian and I were going to get this set up, we had to remove like personal photos from our backgrounds, like our Zoom backgrounds, of just like being mindful of what are you sharing, because we are really public, because we do create content. So that, that's great, but that doesn't mean like my wedding photos need to be part of that content. So of just thinking about it in that way, and just taking some time to clean up your accounts. You're going to hear this from us all the time of just being like, hey, gold star, you reviewed your Amazon account and don't have 100 addresses in there anymore, or, outdated credit cards, whatever it is. So doing that data hygiene for your accounts, especially when you're thinking about social media, I think continues to be important on the security side and also from a privacy perspective. And then have conversations around it. I think this is like a really interesting thing to talk to people about, because I think everybody has different risk tolerances of what they're willing to share online and not, especially when we talk about like, should kids be shared online and should their content be, made readily available by their parents, whatever it is. I think these are interesting conversations that everybody has an opinion on.
Yeah, definitely. It's not an easy decision. And I know people that have logged off of social media in general for a lot of different reasons. And one of them is just a bit of a fear factor. Like, I don't want to, this is more management of information and settings than I want to deal with. And so they decide to go off, and they, maybe they're using Slack to find a community. I've seen a lot of that. You talked about LinkedIn absorbing some of the personal sharing that people used to do on Twitter. I've seen a lot more of, I don't want to say retreating, but it feels a little bit like that, into private groups in things like Slack, things like Signal, where it is less about posting publicly and more about having more intimate, more being able to share more about, like, I'm in a Slack group with a bunch of people, and there's a channel just about, being a parent. And so we share a lot of pictures of kids and, hey, my kid had this particular thing today. We talk about their birthdays and things like that. And I feel comfortable with that because, yeah, Slack is a private company and there's potential data leakage there. But the people that are in there with me are people I trust. And so I'm much more open about sharing that kind of stuff than I would on a platform like Facebook where, yeah, sure, I have it tagged so that only my friends can see it. But what if something shifts in that regard? I've got a lot less control over it at that point. And it is a platform that is designed to connect people. So I don't know that I fully trusted Facebook to not at some point automatically change that so that I had more friends automatically and all of a sudden they have access to that kind of stuff. Like those are the types of things that could potentially happen over time that need to be considered. But anyway, I'm getting back into fear mongering, so I'll leave it at that. Anything else to add before we close out here, Milu?
No, I mean, I think it was an interesting conversation just talking around social media and the thoughts around, what type of content are we making? How are we presenting ourselves? What's the difference between a personal and a business account, and how we all need to be mindful of this? And it just continues. This is like an ongoing thing. Platforms change constantly. So we need to be thinking about how we're representing ourselves on these different platforms as our careers continue, as our families expand and grow, networks change. I think this is a continued conversation we need to be having, but it's an important one because, again, it just ties into that digital footprint. It's there. Once it's out there, it's there. So be mindful of that.
Yep, absolutely. Well, great, everybody. We really appreciate you listening in with us. We hope you learned a thing or two, and we look forward to talking to you on the next episode. Take care.
Yeah, we'll socialize with you soon. Thanks.
Thank you for joining us for another episode of Socializing Security. We hope you learned a thing or two with us.
If you'd like to continue socializing with us on this topic or have feedback, we'd love to hear from you on LinkedIn or social media. Just search for Socializing Security. Or you can email us at info@socializingsecurity.com.
Until next time, stay social and stay secure.